Um, just been reading Time magazine, this edition from a few weeks ago. It's not the latest edition, but I've read an interesting article on the unrest in Baltimore. But halfway through the magazine, this is the article, the roots of a riot. Now I've got another magazine, National Geographic. I'm just showing you these so you know the exact things that I'm looking at, and it is on the sort of Taking Back Detroit. That is the name. Now, both articles dealing with two big American cities that have had more than their share of a negative image over the years, and specifically in recent years, in the case of Detroit, because of its bankruptcy, in the case of Baltimore, because of the riots earlier this year. Now, you'll notice I specifically didn't say race riots because that would be misleading. Before I go on to talk about this, and I'm going to talk more about Baltimore because I haven't read the article fully on Detroit yet. I've gone through it. I want to make some disclaimers. Number one, I am an outsider. Not just that I'm obviously not from those cities. I'm not even from America. That's kind of stating the obvious. But I am an outsider, and I fully acknowledge that fact. So am solely observing these things as someone who's interested in world affairs and things happening all over the world. Um, and solely giving my reflection. I'm not going to pretend that I know everything. I'm not going to pretend that I have a monopoly on truth. Obviously, I don't. I'm not on the ground, so I can't have the sort of raw emotions that people may have on the ground. Nevertheless, I do think it's an interesting subject because when you have these sort of situations in the world's most powerful country, then it inevitably does give some interest to people outside that country. Now, here in the UK, we are hardly perfect in terms of our own record. Maybe not quite as glaring as the United States, but we have also had a history of riots based on issues like poverty and so on. And I'm saying based on those issues, I want to be very clear. It's not the same as making an excuse for rioting. And I think sometimes, especially people on the right, tend to think that if you talk about background of problems, then you must be condoning the consequences, i.e., the riots. Absolutely not. And then people on the right, or sorry, people on the left, if you condemn the rioting, then they think you're being blind to the problems. So as a centrist, I try to take on both aspects, but it is obvious that you cannot talk about this sort of arrest and unrest and pretend it just came from nowhere. Um, the interesting thing about Baltimore is that to simply dismiss it as a black and white issue, I think would be too simplistic. Because when you think about it, the city has a black mayor, Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, a black police commissioner. I'm afraid I can't remember the guy's name, and a black school boards commissioner. Three very important people within the city of Baltimore. And something like 48% of the police force, according to this article, are black. So to simply dismiss it as a black and white issue, I think would be not quite showing the whole picture. Personally, I think it's more a poverty issue rather than a black and white issue. But then, having said that, in the situation of Baltimore, the majority of poverty is in black neighborhoods. And they quoted someone saying that visiting Baltimore was like going back to the civil rights era. It was that sort of divided city. Now, this is interesting for me because Baltimore is actually the only big American city that I've actually been to. We stayed in the United States for a month in 1999. I was only 13 at the time. Baltimore was the one big city we visited. My mother doesn't like big cities, so we stayed predominantly in rural areas. But my memories of that are quite vague because I was only 13. I'm 29 now. But my memory was quite a positive one. I remember seeing the waterfront. Remember we visited some sort of aquarium, sea dive center. Don't really remember much else. I think we went to a restaurant. Actually, my memory is quite vague on that, but I just remember seeing a big city, high-rise buildings and so on. But Baltimore, I think it's fair to say, is one American city that does have exceptionally high crime levels, and it is, I believe it's in the top 10 or 15 cities for homicide rates, up there with St. Louis and a few other places. certainly much higher per head of population than New York City, or even than Los Angeles, as I understand it. So Baltimore's clearly a city that has deep problems. Um, Now, a curious thing is that when Stephanie Rawlings first responded to the unrest that had broken out in Baltimore, which of course was over the death of Freddie Gray, she used thugs to describe those who were rioting. Now, an interesting thing about that is she subsequently had to sort of express regret for saying that. I'm not quite sure why. As an outsider, I I understand that there is difficulty for black leaders to be seen to not be showing empathy to the black community, but I still don't quite understand why she had to apologize over that statement because she clearly wasn't talking about the entire black community. She was clearly talking about people who were burning businesses and looting shops and so on. Now, I think there's a perception that if you're white, you can't really have an opinion on these things, and that's something that I resent. I fully appreciate I cannot be in the shoes of an African American. I cannot know what it's like. I cannot know firsthand the anger and the feeling of being a black man and being followed by security in stores and all this sort of stuff. I fully understand that. But I don't think that means that I can't have an opinion on it, and I don't think it means that I cannot reflect on how I see the situation. And in my opinion, common sense shows us, as President Obama said, that I get that these young men, predominantly young men, some young women, feel angry. I get that. But in the end of the day, that sort of approach is only going to hurt themselves. That isn't going to hurt the police. It's only going to hurt themselves. So it's ridiculous. And I have seen similar things when there was riots going on in France in 2005, when there was riots going on across England in 2011. There's some very similar issues actually. Again, the police relation with the community was a big factor. And in both situations, you had large crowds of predominantly ethnic minority people. In the case of France, largely North Africans, and in the case of London, largely young black Londoners, um, responded, segments of those communities responded with violence. Now, I think it's very, very important that the whole picture is looked at. So before people go off it and say, "Oh, you're generalizing, you're talking about everyone," I agree with the assessment that the magazines just pointed out that it is important. The Time magazines just pointed out that it is important to also recognize that for every rioter who's going to put a stone through a window or burn a business, there will be two other guys who will be willing to clean up afterwards or to go on a peaceful march. But I also think it is important to look at the background. It's no good just saying, well, you have to have a peaceful protest and that's your right, and then that's all very well and we'll get on with this. If you're asking people to have a peaceful protest, then it's fair for them to expect something in return. So my reading is that the situation in Baltimore isn't necessarily predominantly a racial issue, because obviously there is powerful Baltimoreans who are black. So to simply say this is like clearly there's no comparison between the Deep South in the 1960s to Baltimore in the 2010s. So in that sense, it's much less of a racial issue. Nevertheless, it is almost universally young black men who find themselves as victims of brutality. And not just young black men, some black women as well. But clearly, it is predominantly the black community. Now, I've seen reports saying that part of the problem here is that American police, I guess it varies somewhat from state to state, but, and I've seen police officers themselves say this, they're trained to have a warrior mindset. They're almost trained more like soldiers going into a war zone than police officers trying to keep the peace and arrest the bad guys. It's so when they have this inbuilt warrior mindset, this is the opinion. This isn't my words. This is the opinion of former police officers and a lot of analysts on the situation. That instantly creates a situation whereby they are instantly suspicious of young black men, and they instantly see any confrontation as a potential threat situation. So I feel that what happens is you get it's kind of a powder keg waiting to happen. On one side, you have a police officer who's militarized and who has been trained to be wary and to have this warrior-like mindset. On the other hand, you have a black guy who maybe has a history of being stopped by the police solely because he's black, and he resents that. So then you have two people who don't like each other, and it's going to create a confrontational situation. Now, I've always resented the idea that police officers should be immune from any prosecution or immune from criticism or anything like that. And as an outsider, I do feel that there's definite militarization of a lot of police in the United States, and I think that is a very troubling development. Um, so I do understand that a lot of the anger exists. On the other side of the coin, I think that they have an incredibly difficult job to do, and there are situations where they can get shot, and there is a genuine risk to them. So you have to look at both sides of the coin here. In terms of what the answer is, um, obviously addressing poverty is an important thing, but that in itself is not a simple process because I suspect Baltimore has some of the problems with poverty are barely unchanged in decades. I suspect that some of the problems the city faces. Um, I want to be objective here. I'm sure Baltimore, like all big American cities, has made progress. And I still think the homicide rate there is less than it was in the 70s. In fact, I've looked at American big cities and the homicide peaks. In a lot of those big cities, the homicide peaks was in the 1970s. The peak year, i.e., the year that had the most homicides, was often in the 70s, sometimes the late 60s. Um, so clearly, we have to be balanced in terms of how we perceive this. Is the situation out of control? I don't think it's as bad as it was in, for example, the I think it's called the Red Summer or the Summer of Rage in 1968. I don't think we can possibly compare it to that because although people are dying, it's not quite on the same scale as it was in 1968. After the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination, right? So I think it's obvious that it isn't at that stage. Um, in terms of Stephanie Rawlings' comments about thugs, I think she should have apologized if she was talking in general terms, but she was talking about specifics. Now, I suppose there will be some people who say, look, we try the peaceful protest approach, it doesn't work. So violence is the only thing that will get attention. If that is the case, then it's a very, very sad situation, if that is the only way that the problem is going to get attention. Because my sympathy is predominantly for the business owners and the people who were made homeless in some cases because they were burned from the homes. Because a similar thing happened in London. I remember when the London riots were going on in 2011, I had no sympathy for those people who were smashing up buildings and so on. I do agree with President Obama. I do think some of them were basically opportunists. And I think in these situations you get opportunists. Okay, they may have some anger as well, but I do think they're also taking opportunities. So when you see looters, they're doing nothing to help the community. But I also understand the approach that a lot of the black community would take is that wait a second, it's not fair to just look at the rioters and ignore the legitimate grievances that we have. I mean, number one, they have every right to be very angry about this situation. If I was in their shoes, I would be very angry as well. So it's important to recognize that. But, everyone agrees that burning the community is not going to help the problems. And all it's going to do, I mean, they're not targeting the police when they're doing that. They're not burning police officers' homes. They're burning their black brothers and sisters' homes because it's part of the same community, and that I can't comprehend that. I don't understand how anyone could logically try and justify that. Um, so again, I'm a white guy looking on from another country, so I'm not pretending that I can understand all the issues here firsthand. I haven't been a black man followed around shopping center because I happen to be black. I haven't had years of that sort of abuse, so I fully acknowledge that, okay? But there has to be an answer to this problem. Addressing the root causes clearly has to be an issue. Addressing the police relationship with the community. Now, at first I think it was a racial issue because presumably black officers are going to be having just as difficult a job as their white colleagues. I mean, they're making arrests. And why do we not hear about brutality from black officers against black men? I think it would be wrong to say that that never happens. So to make this issue about the police and the black community, the mistrust that lies between them, to make it a solely black and white issue, I think would be somewhat misguided. Although there is unquestionably an issue about the fact that the majority of victims of police brutality are black, that's ignoring the fact that many police forces in America, including St. Louis, although not the Ferguson division from what I gather, actually Ferguson, as I recall, has its independent police force. I don't think it comes under the city of St. Louis. But anyway, my point is, when these problems happen, how can you say it's a situation of white police versus a black community when half the police are black? That doesn't make sense. So that means there has to be more complex issues at stake here. No, I didn't speak so much about Detroit because actually what I did see in the article about Detroit was an optimistic report. It did talk about the problems that Detroit has faced and its image problem, but also spoke about the spirit of Detroit people and the pride that they have in their city. So that's a more it's an interesting article actually, and it doesn't just interview the black community. If you see here, you have an article with a young white man, so it's a good article. And a lot of the things people say, in fact, I'm going to read out some of these things. Um, it's just about their experience of in the city. Antonio Agee, who signs his graffiti Shades, knew Detroit at its worst when he could vandalize buildings without challenge. Now in demand for his art, he says, I work at night, I don't work around people. His hometown is 4 square miles of optimism, surrounded by reality, he says. We're building from the inside out. There's a lot to be developed. People say Detroit is flourishing. Really? Go on the west side where my mum lives, you'll be surprised. I don't know if what he means is the west side is bad or good. I'm not quite sure what he's saying with that. But anyway, they have these interviews with people, and this guy here, Eddie Trezan, aka Bullethead, was born and raised in Detroit. He's a white guy there on the bike. He gets around 139 square miles of the city in his bikes. For casual rides, he rolls up his Schwinn Stingray, his lit-up bike, but he dreams of owning a Ford Aerostar van and is a member of the Knights of the Round Table Van and Truck Club. We're more than a club, we're a family. We watch out for each other, we step up for each other when we need to. I don't know this guy, and I haven't read the full article, but he certainly doesn't look like he's particularly wealthy or so I think in a lot of these circumstances, simply dismissing it as poor black neighborhoods versus wealthy white neighborhoods again might overlook the issue. I mean, it overlooks the issue of white poverty, and it also overlooks the fact that, for example, in the case of prominent black people, the article pointed out quite often they're not actually from the poorest neighborhoods and they live in middle class suburbs and so on. Um, so there's a lot of issues here. Let me know your thoughts on this. Please keep it civil because I've tried my best to be objective with this video. I certainly don't want to offend anyone or anything like that. And I'm going to delete any comments accusing me of racism because I won't have myself slandered on something that clearly is not the case. So just going to delete any remarks that accuse me of that. Um, so please keep it civil. I don't mind people expressing anger, but keep it civil. Thanks for watching.